The 37mm M1916 cannon represents one of the most disappointing tank weapons ever fielded, not because it was poorly built, but because it was catastrophically outdated the moment it entered service. Originally designed during World War I for infantry support, this gun was later mounted on early interwar tanks that were already struggling with armor, mobility, and reliability. By the time armored warfare evolved in the late 1930s, the M1916 had become a liability rather than an asset. Its low muzzle velocity meant armor penetration was extremely limited. Against even lightly armored enemy vehicles, the shell often failed to penetrate, forcing crews to dangerously close distances. This turned the tank into a rolling target rather than a battlefield threat. In combat simulations and early exercises, crews quickly realized that the weapon was ineffective against modern threats, leaving tanks armed with it unable to fulfill either an anti-armor or fire support role. Worse still, the gun's limited ammunition types reduced tactical flexibility. High explosive rounds were weak, armor-piercing rounds were unreliable, and reload times were slow under stress. When mounted on already cramped and poorly ventilated tanks, the weapon increased crew fatigue without providing meaningful combat power. In effect, the 37mm M1916 transformed these vehicles into death traps, machines that looked intimidating but failed catastrophically when real combat began. The short-barrel 75mm L-24 gun is a classic example of a weapon that became obsolete almost overnight. Originally intended for infantry support, this gun was mounted on several early World War II tanks that would later gain a reputation for poor survivability. While effective against unarmored targets and fortifications, it was disastrously inadequate in tank versus tank combat. Its low velocity meant shells followed a slow, arcing trajectory, giving enemy crews ample time to react. Against modern armor, penetration was inconsistent at best and impossible at worst. Crews found themselves firing repeatedly with little effect, exposing their tank to return fire. In engagements against faster, better-armed enemy vehicles, tanks equipped with the L-24 were often destroyed before they could reposition. The psychological impact on crews was severe. Knowing your main gun could not reliably defeat enemy armor created hesitation and fear inside the vehicle. Instead of hunting enemy tanks, crews were forced into defensive or support roles they were never meant to survive in. This mismatch between weapon capability and battlefield reality turned many of these tanks into rolling coffins once the war escalated. The Soviet 45mm 20K cannon is often remembered as a weapon with promise that failed under pressure. On paper, it appeared capable, reasonable caliber, acceptable penetration figures, and mass production potential. In reality, when mounted on poorly armored and mechanically unreliable light tanks, it became part of a lethal combination of design failures. While the gun could defeat early war armor, its effectiveness dropped sharply as enemy tanks improved. Accuracy issues, inconsistent shell quality, and poor optics severely reduced real-world performance. Crews frequently reported multiple hits with little effect, especially at combat ranges beyond ideal conditions. Combined with thin armor and weak engines, tanks armed with the 20K were often destroyed before they could disengage. Perhaps the greatest flaw was how the weapon encouraged overconfidence. Commanders believed their tanks were adequately armed, leading them into engagements they could not survive. When facing better protected enemy vehicles, the gun's limitations became fatal. In this way, the 45mm 20K didn't just fail, it actively contributed to catastrophic losses, earning its place among the weapons that helped define the worst tanks ever built. The 47mm SA-35 gun is often described as one of the great ironies of armored warfare. Technically, it was a capable weapon with respectable penetration for its time, yet, when mounted on poorly designed French tanks, it became part of a system that utterly failed in real combat. The gun itself was not the problem. The tank design around it turned potential into disaster. Most French tanks using the SA-35 were fitted with cramped one-man turrets. This forced a single crew member to aim, load, fire, observe the battlefield, and command the tanks simultaneously. Even with a good gun, this workload was overwhelming. In fast-moving battles, the gun's slow rate of fire and limited situational awareness made it nearly useless against coordinated enemy armor. Reloading under pressure was exhausting. Accuracy dropped sharply and reaction times lagged behind opponents who used multi-crew turrets. As a result, tanks armed with the 47mm SA-35 were often destroyed despite having a weapon that could theoretically defeat the enemy. This mismatch between weapon capability and crew survivability turned many of these vehicles into lethal traps, proving that even a decent gun cannot save a fundamentally flawed tank. The British 2-pounder gun stands as a textbook example of a weapon designed with tunnel vision, excellent at penetrating early war armor. It lacked one critical capability that would doom the tanks carrying it: an effective high-explosive shell. This single omission transformed many British tanks into specialists that could fight other tanks, but were nearly helpless against everything else. On the battlefield, armored warfare is never just tank versus tank. Crews faced infantry, anti-tank guns, buildings, and fortified positions. Without a useful round, tanks armed with the 2-pounder were unable to suppress enemy defenses, leaving them vulnerable to ambush, even when they penetrated enemy armor. The internal damage caused by the shell was often limited. As enemy armor improved, the 2-pounder rapidly lost relevance. British crews found themselves stuck with a weapon that excelled briefly before becoming obsolete. Combined with thin armor and mechanical reliability issues, tanks carrying this gun became increasingly fragile. In many cases, the weapon's narrow usefulness directly contributed to battlefield. The Italian 37mm L-21 gun represents the danger of entering modern war with outdated assumptions. Designed primarily for colonial conflicts and infantry support, it was mounted on Italian tanks that were already underpowered, under-armored, and mechanically fragile. Against modern opponents, this weapon was hopelessly inadequate. Penetration was poor, effective range was short, and accuracy suffered badly under combat conditions. To engage enemy armor, Italian tank crews were often forced into dangerously close distances, where their thin armor offered little protection. Even when hits were achieved, the results were frequently ineffective, allowing enemy tanks to return fire with devastating consequences. Perhaps most damning was the psychological impact. Crews knew their main gun could not reliably defeat enemy vehicles, creating hesitation and defensive behavior that reduced battlefield effectiveness. Instead of projecting power, tanks armed with the Breda 37mm became liabilities, vehicles that could neither fight nor survive. In the harsh environments where these tanks operated, the gun helped seal their reputation as rolling death traps. The 20mm KWK-30 autocannon perfectly illustrates how early confidence in light tanks collapsed under the pressure of real war. Mounted on Germany's earliest armored vehicles, this weapon was originally intended to counter infantry, soft-skinned vehicles, and lightly armored targets. In the opening phases of the war, it seemed adequate. That illusion shattered almost immediately. As enemy armor improved, the 20mm autocannon became almost useless against tanks. Its rounds lacked the mass and penetration required to cause meaningful damage, even at close range. Crews often fired entire magazines with little effect, exposing their vehicle's position while achieving nothing. Against opponents armed with heavier guns, these light tanks were destroyed in seconds. The rapid obsolescence of the KWK-30 forced German crews into dangerous tactics, relying on speed and surprise rather than firepower. But when escape was impossible, the weapon offered no last-chance defense. Instead of empowering the tank, the 20mm cannon trapped crews inside vehicles that could neither fight nor survive once the battlefield evolved. Barber. The Type 94 37mm gun reflects the fatal consequences of underestimating armored warfare. Designed during a period when Japan expected to fight lightly equipped opponents, the gun was mounted on tanks that emphasized mobility over protection. Against infantry, it was serviceable. Against modern tanks, it was a death sentence. Penetration was extremely limited, forcing crews into dangerously close engagements. Even at ideal distances, successful armor penetration was inconsistent. Worse still, poor optics and limited traverse made accurate fire difficult under combat stress. Japanese tank crews often found themselves unable to respond effectively to enemy armor before being destroyed. As the war progressed and enemy tanks grew heavier, the Type 94 became completely obsolete. Crews were left trapped inside vehicles armed with a weapon that could not protect them. This gap between expectation and reality transformed many Japanese tanks into death traps, machines that could move but could not fight or survive. The short-barrel 47mm gun, used on early Japanese medium tanks, is a clear example of a weapon trapped between roles. Intended to provide both infantry support and anti-armor capability, it ultimately failed at both. While slightly more powerful than earlier Japanese tank guns, it still lacked the penetration needed to challenge modern armor. Its low muzzle velocity and short effective range forced tanks into close combat, where their thin armor offered little protection. Against enemy tanks, crews often fired multiple rounds with little effect, only to be destroyed by return fire. Against fortified positions, the limited explosive power reduced its usefulness. The result was a weapon that created false confidence. Commanders believed their tanks were adequately armed, leading to tactical decisions that placed crews in unwinnable situations. When reality set in, it was often too late. The gun's limitations played a direct role in turning these tanks into some of the most vulnerable armored vehicles of the war. The 76mm L11 gun is often remembered as a weapon that looked powerful on paper, but failed catastrophically in practice. Mounted on early Soviet heavy tanks, it was intended to give crews a decisive advantage through sheer caliber. Instead, poor manufacturing quality and outdated ballistic performance turned this gun into a liability at the worst possible time. Penetration was inconsistent, accuracy was unreliable, and shell quality varied widely. Even when fired correctly, the gun struggled against improved enemy armor. Combined with limited optics and cramped turret conditions, crews found it difficult to acquire targets quickly or adjust fire under pressure. In high-intensity combat, these flaws proved deadly. Heavy tanks armed with the L11 often became priority targets, yet their main weapon could not reliably fight back. The result was a cruel paradox. Tanks designed to break enemy lines instead trapped their crews inside slow-moving, highly visible vehicles with underperforming firepower. In these moments, the L11 helped transform heavy armor into a death trap rather than a breakthrough weapon. The 57mm ZS-4 gun was a weapon designed with a single obsession: armor penetration. When mounted on select Soviet tanks, it delivered impressive penetration figures for its size. But this narrow focus created serious battlefield problems, especially when paired with tanks that lacked the versatility to support it. The gun fired small, high-velocity rounds that punched through armor but caused limited internal damage. Without an effective high-explosive shell, it struggled to engage infantry, fortifications, or anti-tank positions. In the chaos of combined arms warfare, this left tanks armed with the ZS-4 dangerously exposed. EWS quickly discovered that penetration alone does not win battles. Against mixed threats, the gun forced tanks into specialized roles they could not always avoid. When enemy forces adapted, these tanks became easy targets. The ZS-4's extreme specialization helped turn its host vehicles into tactical dead ends, machines powerful in theory, but fatally limited in reality. The 37mm K-36 is infamous as one of the most obsolete anti-armor weapons of World War II. While originally designed as a towed anti-tank gun, it was also adapted for tank-mounted use, a decision that sealed the fate of the vehicles carrying it. By the time it saw widespread combat, enemy armor had already surpassed its capabilities. The gun's rounds frequently bounced off even moderately armored targets, earning it a reputation for ineffectiveness. Crews were forced into dangerously close engagements, often within range of enemy weapons that could destroy them in a single shot. Each failed penetration increased exposure and risk. Psychologically, the PAK-36 was devastating. Crews knew their weapon was inadequate, undermining confidence and morale. Mounted on tanks that were already vulnerable, the gun removed any illusion of survivability. Instead of serving as a fighting chance, it locked crews inside vehicles that could not win, could not escape, and could not endure. The 50mm KWK-38L 42 gun represents a moment when German tank development fell behind the battlefield. Designed as an upgrade from earlier light tank weapons, it initially appeared to offer improved penetration and versatility. But as enemy armor advanced rapidly, the KWK-38 quickly revealed its limitations. Longer combat ranges, penetration dropped sharply, forcing crews to close the distance in order to remain effective. This exposed tanks armed with the KWK-38 to return fire from enemies equipped with longer barrel guns and heavier shells. Even when hits were achieved, Internal damage was often insufficient to disable enemy tanks immediately. Problem was not just the gun itself, but timing. By the time it entered widespread service, the battlefield had already moved on. Tanks carrying the KWK-38 found themselves trapped between outdated firepower and increasingly lethal opponents. In this environment, the gun helped turn once respectable vehicles into fragile machines with shrinking chances of survival. The 75mm Type 3 gun was Japan's attempt to catch up in an arms race it had already lost. Designed to counter increasingly powerful enemy armor, the weapon arrived too late and was mounted on tanks that lacked the protection and mobility needed to survive modern combat. While more powerful than earlier Japanese guns, it could not compensate for the weaknesses of its host vehicles. Manufacturing shortages limited ammunition quality and consistency. Accuracy suffered, and rate of fire was slow under combat conditions. Against well-armored opponents, the gun struggled to achieve decisive results before enemy fire destroyed the tank carrying it. In practice, the Type 3 created a cruel illusion of parity. Crews believed they finally had a weapon capable of fighting back, but the battlefield reality proved otherwise. The gun's delayed arrival and limited effectiveness ensured that tanks armed with it remained dangerously exposed, reinforcing their reputation as some of the most vulnerable vehicles of the war. The Italian 90mm Cannone da 9053 is a fascinating example of raw power applied without proper integration. As an anti-aircraft and anti-tank gun, it was formidable. But when adapted for tank or semi-armored mounts, its size and recoil created severe operational problems. The weapon's sheer bulk limited mobility, traverse, and rate of fire. Crews struggled to reposition quickly, making them vulnerable to flanking attacks. In many cases, the gun's power exceeded the survivability of the vehicle carrying it. Enemies simply targeted the lightly protected platform and destroyed it before the weapon could be brought to bear. This imbalance turned a potentially devastating weapon into a liability. Instead of providing protection, the gun attracted enemy attention and trapped crews inside vehicles that could not withstand return fire. The result was another example of how mismatched design choices transformed armored vehicles into deadly traps. The 75mm M2 short-barrel gun highlights how rapidly armored warfare outpaced early war assumptions. Designed primarily for infantry support, this weapon was mounted on early American medium tanks at a time when tank versus tank combat was becoming the dominant threat. While effective against soft targets, it was dangerously inadequate against modern armor. Its low muzzle velocity resulted in poor penetration and a slow shell trajectory, making long-range engagements nearly impossible. Enemy tanks equipped with higher velocity guns could engage and destroy these vehicles before they had a chance to respond effectively. Crews were often forced into close-range combat, where survival depended more on luck than design. The gun's limitations turned otherwise promising tanks into transitional machines, vehicles that existed between eras, armed for a war that was already ending. In high-intensity battles, this mismatch transformed the tank into a liability, trapping crews inside vehicles that could not fight on equal terms. The 40mm Vickers gun was widely exported during the interwar period, finding its way onto numerous light and medium tanks across the world. At the time, it was seen as a balanced weapon, compact, reliable, and adequate for anticipated threats. War quickly proved otherwise. As armor thickness increased, the Vickers gun struggled to maintain relevance. Penetration fell short, and shell effectiveness declined sharply against modern targets. Tanks armed with this gun were forced into roles they were never meant to survive, engaging enemies that could destroy them with ease. Worse still, many of the tanks carrying the Vickers gun lacked proper upgrades, leaving crews stuck with obsolete firepower well into the war. This stagnation turned once modern vehicles into death traps, machines that could neither disengage nor overpower their opponents once the battlefield evolved. The 47mm bowler gun was respected as a lightweight anti-tank weapon, but when adapted for tank use, its limitations became painfully clear. Designed for portability rather than sustained armored combat, it lacked the penetration and destructive power needed for modern tank warfare. Mounted on lightly armored vehicles, the bowler gun forced crews into close-range engagements where survivability dropped to near zero. While capable against early war armor, it rapidly lost effectiveness as protection improved. Tanks equipped with it became dangerously exposed once enemy forces adapted. In the end, the bowler gun represents a recurring theme throughout armored history, adapting the wrong weapon to the wrong platform. Instead of extending the tank's lifespan, it shortened it. For the crews inside, this mismatch often meant entering battle with no realistic chance of survival, the ultimate definition of a death trap.